Entering a new year with a volatile housing market, new questions, challenges, and situations arise for next generation and current homeowners. African Americans navigating the housing market encounter challenges that are historically and culturally intertwined. Tim Henderson, staff writer for the Pew Research Center, explains that based on U.S. Census data, the homeownership gap between Black and white Americans is wider now than it was in 1960. Hello, my name is Jaden Gabe, and this is Black America, the Hurdles of Homeowning. My research question is, to what extent has housing policy in the United States addressed the housing needs and challenges of African Americans in the last 30 years? My answer is not really. Even though the United States has recognized racial inequities in the housing market, major challenges of Black homeownership still persist. So what are these challenges? In my presentation, I'll present first gentrification and how Black Americans are displaced from their communities. Second, environmental racism and how Black communities are hit the hardest by climate change. And third, exclusionary zoning and how Black Americans are barred from accessing affordable homes. And finally, find some possible solutions to help African Americans overcome these challenges and point policy in the right direction. So first, gentrification. Gentrification is a very complex word to define. So for the sake of my presentation, I'll define it as the process in which neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status experience an investment and an influx of residents of higher socioeconomic status. Gentrification often results in the displacement of Black Americans. According to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, between the years 2000 and 2013, over 100,000 Black residents were displaced due to gentrification. This map is a dot map of the gentrified tracts by city between 2012 and 2017, or 4 years after it was found thousands of Americans were displaced through the process. Evidently, you can see across America that then all across various cities, there's African Americans are being displaced and gentrification is getting out of control. As we can see in the northeastern United States, in the Bosnia-Wash corridor, that most gentrification occurs in cities such as Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. Similarly, when we look towards the western United States and California, we can see similar numbers in cities such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. Evidently, this shows how gentrification still plays an imperative role in the American housing market, and how it still impacts Black and disadvantaged residents, and the need for reform. Next, environmental racism. Some of you might be asking, what does housing have to do, or race have to do with the environment? Well, in the College Board stimulus, Urban Evolution, how species adapt to live in cities. Simone de Roches, evolutionary ecologist, found that racial discrimination has set the stage for extremely different urban environments. Compared to wealthier ones, impoverished ones experience more environmental disadvantages, such as higher temperatures and greater exposure to pollution. This infographic illustrates the many ways that climate change seeps into communities of color. For example, 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. Moreover, almost 40% of people of color experience higher nitrogen dioxide exposure and are almost 2 times more likely to live without safe drinking water and modern sanitation. This shows how environmental racism, an emerging challenge amid a climate crisis, is impacting disadvantaged residents and Black Americans alike, and the need for reform from an environmental lens. Next, exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning refers to laws and regulations that determine whether a building can and cannot be situated in an area. In respect to residential zoning, local governments do this through height limits, lot size requirements, and units per building. The most common type of exclusionary zoning in the United States is single-family zoning, with 75% of the land in the U.S. being zoned for single-family detached homes. This in turn impacts Black Americans and other disadvantaged residents by decreasing the number of affordable and multifamily homes within an area. This graph represents the demographic change in the California Bay Area as single family zoning restrictions increase. As you can see in the red, purple, and gray, as single family zoning restrictions, the minority groups of Hispanics, blacks, and other minorities plummeted, with blacks at the very bottom, as in yellow, white Americans skyrocketed. This shows the urgent need to reform single-family zoning policies to allow for minorities and black Americans to have a seat at the table in the housing market. So what are our solutions, and how do we point policy in the right direction and help African Americans overcome these challenges? First, I propose inclusionary housing policies, and second, neighborhood stabilization. Inclusionary housing policies means constructing more multifamily and missing middle homes, such as duplexes, triplexes, and townhouses that are more affordable for disadvantaged residents. And this also means encouraging local governments to reform zoning laws to allow these new homes to be built. And encouraging neighborhood stabilization, on the other hand, means introducing local regulations that protect residents instead of displacing them or harming their communities. This also means positively investing in them in ways so they don't get displaced from processes such as environmental injustice or gentrification. However, these two have two major limitations. Most importantly, that these take time to put into motion. And with a rising affordable housing crisis, we're truthfully running out of time. And also that zoning reforms could negatively impact affluent residents. While a lesser limitation, it's still important to recognize that when we introduce new homes into an area, it'll then decrease the property values of those living in those areas, therefore affluent residents. Sure, I would just like to use my word cited. Thank you.
All right, two questions I have for you.
Yeah.
Was there evidence that you gathered that you didn't use, and why didn't you use it?
Evidence I didn't gather was more so regarding, it was more about the health effects of housing conditions in black and colored communities. I did not use it simply because of time constraints, because my research required spread across different areas, as you saw in my research, with different topics stretching from gentrification to zoning policies. So it was simply difficult to include this evidence into my presentation.
All right, and second question. What advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
I would say first, most importantly, study the history, because I believe you can't really you have to understand the basis of why Black Americans are still struggling to gain homeownership or buy more houses in the housing market. So that's where I would first start.